All right, everyone, welcome back from break. I took the hour break. I had I had a little sandwich. I don't want to tell Lisa this, but it was a gluten-free bread, Lisa. Don't be offended by my gluten-free bread.
That's good.
No, actually it is. It is good. I mean, it kind of falls apart. I can go on and on about food, as anyone that knows me will tell you. But anyway, welcome to session 3, 12:30 to 3. I'll be leading the afternoon. And really, I kind of organize things into 3 main buckets. The first bucket being, we're going to listen to a message by Chang. He is the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies consultant for the Standards Project. Okay, so he's going to talk a lot about just some like overarching themes that we've been thinking about as we've been going through the Standards Project. So session 3 really is focused on an intro into the Standards project that we've been doing. I'll go over all of that. So the second phase really is about kind of the nuts and bolts of how we made this whole thing pull together. I'm going to go over the origins. I'm going to go over how things have kind of developed since last summer into like, how do we develop the actual process for carrying out the Standards Project? Because just so you know, right now, as we're speaking, the editors for the Standards Project are meeting and they're looking over the first draft and they're trying to kind of coalesce things to make sure they kind of fit together. And then the last part, it's going to be Steve and I are going to lead a part about controversy in the classroom. So like, how do you deal with this issue or that issue, what have you? So this is kind of like when the rubber meets the roads, when you're actually using the standards and let's say some controversy comes up, which it can, what do you do? And how do you work with it? And that's going to be interactive. Actually, the whole day is going to be interactive. So I know there's a bunch of people here, which I'm so glad to see everyone here. We're going to listen to first Chang. But before we get into that, I just want to welcome everyone again to the Social Studies Virtual Summer Institute, hosted by the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies and Connecticut State Department of Ed. We have this session here, which is June. You're already in that. We're halfway through, just about halfway through. And then we have another session coming up in August. Similar information, but it's going to be different. Right. So if people want to go to the one in June and the one in August, there will be some differences in there. So but we are trying to kind of give kind of the basis. You know, we're trying to build the foundation here. And in August, what I could tell you is we're going to have a much more developed standards document that you can look at and put some review time into. Actually, tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the first draft. We're going to be looking at some draft standards. And we're going to be actually reviewing them. So I think that could be fun. Anyway, a little bit more about me. Anthony Roy, you may have seen this slide from yesterday. I just kind of use the same one again. President, Connecticut Council for the Social Studies. Also, I'm a teacher, classroom teacher, tried and true. I've been in it for about 14, 15 years now, depending on when you count when I started. ConnecticutSocialStudies.org. That's where you can find more information about the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies. There's my email in case you want to reach out. Also, if you want to learn more about me and about my travels, canoe52.com. My wife and I are trying to canoe all 50 states, plus Puerto Rico and DC. I mean, I think there'll be a state one day, maybe. And essentially, you can see our escapades. We take pictures and we blog about it. I don't know, it's kind of cute. I don't know, it's funny. You can see my dog. And just as a reminder, not only is the Connecticut Council for the Social Studies and Connecticut State Department of Ed, but we also have funding for this project from Connecticut Humanities and support from Connecticut Democracy Center. So these are really the 4 main entities that are bringing the Standards Project to fruition. So like I said, we're going to start off by hearing a little bit of a keynote from Chang, University of Connecticut. He is the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies consultant. And the way that we're going to break this up is I'm going to play just about 6 minutes or so, and then we'll discuss the first question that's up there. Then I'll play it for another 7 minutes. We'll discuss the second question, third and fourth, what have you. And let's take about an hour or so, 45 minutes to an hour. And then again, like I said, we'll go into how are the standards working. So this is a presentation that some of the writers saw. Actually, all the writers saw part of this presentation. This is what we used in the writing kickoff training. So I figured, hey, let's give these folks some of the training that we're given to the writers for the standards project. So again, I'm going to play this, and then in about 6.5 minutes or so, we'll pause and we will discuss. All right. And if you can't hear it, Donna, it's up to you to wave your hand like this if you can't hear the video. Okay. It should be able to hear it though. All right. Thanks, Donna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Chang. I'm an associate professor of history and Asian and Asian American studies at the University of Connecticut. I also direct the Institute for Asian and Asian American Studies there. Let's see, I wear a couple of other hats that are sort of relevant to this work. I am on the Governor's Hate Crimes Advisory Council. Hartford. And I'm also the state director for our campaign at Make Us Visible Connecticut, which has been advocating for Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in the legislature. So we had 2 bills, one last year, one this year, doing great work, well, obviously with the K-8 model curriculum, and this year making AAPI studies mandatory. So very excited about this work. And just so, excited for this team to be tackling this with all of its other dimensions, and my fellow panelists here. So this is really important work, and, really visionary to thinking about, what is 21st century, social studies and public education mean? What does that look like? So very, very excited for this work, and to be, working with you. So I've been asked to kind of think through a couple different things. One is just to, applaud, this kind of formation, or these 6 themes of the standards, of justice, representation, inclusivity, global context, agency, and local connections. And really think these are wonderful, touchstones that will, I think, continue to it helps me to refocus, my thoughts on how to build what we've been thinking of as homegrown Asian American studies and Pacific Islander studies in Connecticut. What does that look like for our state here? And so this is really important work. And then to just kind of give an understanding of what's sort of the current state of Asian American studies and Pacific Islander studies. I mean, as many of you probably know, this has been a very challenging, time for Asian Americans, with, record increases in surges in hate crimes against Asian Americans, with just this week, shootings against 3 Korean women were shot in Dallas. So, the ways that the legacy and the tradition of anti-Asian hatred in the country has kind of bubbled up through the pandemic has reinforced, this, a long need to address invisibility that our community has faced. And so right now, I think what we could say is that there is kind of an Asian American renaissance happening. Many other states like Connecticut are thinking about hate prevention through education, through anti-violence, anti-racism work happens through education, not through policing, and so seeing this kind of work happening in other states is very exciting, and they will have to do their own work to think of what it means for them. And what all of this has done is really activated, generated a new generation of Asian Americans who want to be involved, who want to help shape the future. And that this has been organized around the need for more education. And so it's very exciting, because what this means is, with attention to K through 12 education and Asian American studies, we're going to be looking at we'll be creating the educational conditions for the first generation of Asian Americans in the country. This is 2022, to be seen in the curriculum in public education. This just hasn't happened before. The notion that that Asian Americans have been contributors and belong to the country had not been present in the national discourse, and so it has led to their invisibility. So this is really exciting. First time in the country's history to have this kind of mobilization. So this is really important work here in Connecticut that other states are going to be looking at and watching, see how we do this work. So and we're very excited and think this is going to be a wonderful way to show other states what what their work could look like. And because of the invisibility and lack of coverage for Asian American studies in this area, is that we have the capacity now to really address long-standing mental health needs that have gone unmet for Asian American students. And we know that the importance of social emotional learning, and so this is an important step to advancing and broadening that work. And then also what Asian American studies does in general too is very important to this particular project on social studies standards, is it breaks down the binary between binary understanding of race as sort of black and white, and it really opens up a broader conversation about racial formations, racial construction, and how there are different positions in a society in which to think of race. So these are really important dimensions to the inclusion of Asian American studies in K through 12 education, particularly for our work in social studies standards. So now,
Of course, I'm on mute, right? All right, we're going to pause right there. Actually, let me go ahead and stop my share. The question that we're going to discuss is, what is the state of diversity education in your experience? So what have you experienced with diversity education? Maybe there's been some celebration. Maybe there's been some pushback. What does diversity education look like in your neck of the woods? Anybody could jump in here.
From Tony, from the first grade experience again, I'm just going on that. I think,
Yeah, of course.
And again, well, I like to not only pay attention to things when we're discussing that topic or that theme, but make it consistent throughout the year. And I think just by using the children and their own experiences and their own families, which we do in first grade, we get bigger from me, myself, my family, etc. Just using those examples and sharing those examples and talking about everyday holidays and everyday things that happen across the world, you're opening that up for more conversation and an easiness for them to discuss it later on. Not new when they get older. There's not, it's easier, I think, for them.
Sounds like exposure is key here. So you're saying
absolutely
open up these lines of connection, let's say.
I agree. That's a good way to put it.
And I also want to say thank you for going first. It's really hard, especially this topic, very hard.
The teacher in me.
Community, right? So thank you so much for that.
No worries. You can shut me up at any time, anybody.
Never that. Any other brave souls? Go ahead, Brian.
Hi,
Then
good
we'll go to Lauren.
afternoon. How are
Good
you?
afternoon.
Let me speak from my perspective as an administrator and an instructional coach, so not working directly with students. And I've worked in three urban districts in the state of Connecticut over the last 20 years. And I have to say that I'm a little disappointed in what we have been through as instructional leaders. And that is to say that we seem to start the ball rolling. And in the last, I don't know, 3 to 4 years, I've probably worked with half a dozen different consultants on DEI education. And it seems like we always start the same way and it never gets very deep. And so we keep kind of rehashing the initial concepts and, confronting inherent biases and that sort of thing. And I want to know, all right, when can we bring this to the level of the classroom? When are we going to bring this to the level of the classroom? So for me personally, it has been a little disappointing over the last few years. And I hope that there are people out there and on this screen or not on the screen who have had more fulfilling experiences in all of this, but I have yet to really see it play out well at the classroom level.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great. It sounds like, if I'm listening well, it sounds like Brian's looking for some more and deeper training than what he's been able to get.
Absolutely.
I mean, so often we're just kind of at step one, and then we always go back to step one. Always go back to step one. I could see that. I could see that. Let's go to Lauren. Go ahead, Lauren. What do you think?
I have the perspective of a teacher. So originally I'm from New York City, and I worked with English language learners for the last 9 years. So my perspective is a little different because I've been immersed and surrounded by so many different cultures. It's always a focal point in my practice to incorporate their cultures, just because I've seen, even within one language community, there's a variety of cultures that belong to that language community. So for Arabic, for instance, a lot of times teachers like to group students according to the same language family. Well, I found out quickly that not all Arabic speakers share the same culture. So, you see little scuffles with students and you're like, what's going on? What's wrong? And then I learned, okay, well, there are different belief systems and, we're grouping students in a very heterogeneous manner, which they've never been exposed to this. They're used to going to school with a single gender. So there's a lot of things I've opened up to. It's totally different than my educational experience. And then my other perspective would be coming to the state of Connecticut for the first time. One of the things that the building leaders asked was that everyone have an open mind and try to change their perspective, specifically with our social studies department. So all teachers were encouraged to read the book Stamped. So that was a very new take on just presenting history to students, American history to students. And at first I thought, oh, well, our textbooks are not really presenting maybe the facts. But when I read the book, I'm like, wait, the facts are right here. It's just more of maybe a societal difference. So I didn't have to really find any new resources. It was just read what's there and let's discuss what's there and what happened. And sometimes when I would pose questions to students, their answers reflected what they were taught or what they were told and not what the textbook actually said. So I found that to be very interesting because I came in like, all right, I need to find all these new resources and different things because these books aren't presenting facts accurately, but they were. It was just a difference in culture or the way things were being presented from the outside.
Wow. Thank you for that. One thing I heard you say is this idea of almost like intersectionality, right? People have multiple different parts of who they are that are kind of influences the way we think about the world, right? So, who I am, the different pieces of that. It's like this idea of intersectionalism, which is something that's actually in the guiding principles. And tomorrow, when we get into the guiding principles, we're going to talk a little bit more about the different values, I guess you could say, that are guiding the process here. Any other comments before we go back to the video about the state of social studies or the state, of diversity ed? in your view or in your perspective, your neck of the woods? You know, one thing that I'm keenly aware of, and I know Steve is keenly aware of as well, is the amount of pressure that there is around diversity education, really in both directions, right? We're either not doing enough or we're doing too much. And it's like almost this tumultuous time where you're not even sure how is it that you can navigate, you know, how do I serve my students the best way that I can and the best way that I know how, but with also balancing what families in the community want. It's a tough question. And who could tell me, where are we seeing this play out in a very public way? Maybe you've seen some of the Board of Ed discussions that are happening right here in the state, right? So there is definitely, for social studies, let's be honest, right? For social studies teachers, there is a little bit of a tightrope that we're walking sometimes. And it's hard to get it 100% right. I don't think we can get it 100% right, but we can do our best. That's what I hope anyway. So the next question that we're going to look at, I'm going to try to go back to sharing my screen here. Oh yeah, I got it. It's almost like I know what I'm doing. Let's see if it works. Bang, look at that. The next question is, we're going to talk a little bit more about how teachers can navigate public scrutiny in the current era. He's going to talk a little bit about this for the next, 5 to 7 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and chat it up again.
What I failed to mention at the very beginning is that when we're talking about Asian American studies and Pacific Islander studies, these are two different fields. They're two different pan-ethnicities. That means is that there's many different ethnic groups within the racial umbrella, if you will, of Asian American, right? You can have Taiwanese Americans, you can have Chinese Americans, you can have Japanese Americans, but we need to understand that there are Burmese Americans, and there are Nepalese Americans, as well as Pakistanis, right? So this is really a really broad set of ethnic groups, and that Pacific Islanders are also a pan-ethnic group that are different than Asians, particularly through their relationship of indigenous sovereignty to their islands. So these are two separate pieces of that often get lumped together, but we're very intentional about saying we want Asian American studies and Pacific Islander studies, because both are so essential to understanding the complexity and the accuracy of understanding, of an accurate understanding of U.S. history. So the current state of Pacific Islander studies has been very interesting. That's part of the reason why I'm giving you this introduction via video, because I'm in downtown Honolulu, where I've been talking with educators here in Hawaii. And they have a two-language, Hawaii is now a two-language education system, English and Hawaiian. And one of the biggest struggles, one of the biggest things that they've tried to work with here is that Hawaiian education in the state is addressing particularly the history of U.S. relations of colonization within the islands. And so this is a really important dimension of understanding the Pacific Islander social context and history, and that in order to kind of understand those ethnic groups, we have to really unpack those colonial narratives and discourses and images of Pacific Islanders to really understand those communities in a more robust and compelling way. So really, AAPI, as just 4 letters, but it really includes these 2 distinct fields of study. They are often interrelated, but they are distinct fields. So I've been asked to also kind of think about how does this work stand up against public scrutiny. And one of the things that we've been doing through the Make Us Visible campaign is to really base our activism on this notion that there's nothing about us without us, meaning that this push for legislation has come through community engagement to find other parents and students and teachers and allies and community members who want to see this work in the world. And that really helped us to think of what are the stakes for what are the processes and the and the modes of communication that we need to build, so that what we end up with is community supported curriculum, and that communities can see themselves reflected in the work that we produce. And so that's been my approach at the Institute at UConn. It's my research focus now is on local communities. And so I hope that can contribute to this larger work. But the public scrutiny about adding Asian American studies seems so, so like such a clear need because of its glaring absence. And the invisibility of Asian Americans has often been predicated by the notion of the kind of model minority idea, that there aren't problems within the Asian American community that need to be thought of, resolved, addressed. And so those kinds of assumptions have really underscored this, this invisibility. So in the face of the surge in anti-Asian violence in the country, these modes of inclusion in the curriculum are really a intergenerational solution to racism and violence. Something that I think has the potential to create new possibilities for communities. And I think given the basic facts that there have not been that much covered on Asian American, that what we hopefully will see is that there are better outcomes for Asian Americans, better mental health outcomes, perhaps more career diversity for Asian Americans, that they don't always go to STEM fields, that they participate in many other fields, and so this is also something that we can kind of identify too with Pacific Islander studies.
Oop, that didn't go the way I wanted to. But anyway, that's okay. We'll come back to it. So the next question that we're looking at here really has to do with kind of getting it right, navigating, as I put here, navigating the the public scrutiny in the current era. How is it that we think that we can do justice to make sure that there's representation in the curriculum? What do we think here?
From a teacher's perspective, I think we can do more with continuing to always enrich our read alouds and our exposure to our students, with trying to give them different perspectives. And maybe even if they haven't seen that culture or are exposed to different cultures, it's important for them to have that, maybe even through the use of read alouds and conversations.
And your name, is it
Andrea?
Andrea. I almost said
Yes.
Andrea. I wasn't sure. I bet you get
Either's
that a lot.
fine.
And what do you teach? Where do you teach? What grade?
4th grade in New Hartford.
In New Hartford. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So you were saying something about making sure that there's more representation in the materials, right? Could be one way. So we're saying that for some folks, the books could be a window, right, into another place or another culture or another set of backgrounds, right? For others, of course, depending on where you're teaching, who the students are, it could be a mirror, right? They can see themselves in there, right? So that's what we're seeing here, is we're seeing these windows and these mirrors. How else can we go ahead and make sure that we are, kind of navigating the scrutiny that could come from that, right? Because if you're putting one book in, you're taking another book out, potentially. So how is it that we can, walk that line? Because it seems like what Andrea's saying is that it's important. That's what I heard her say. She didn't say those words, but that's what I heard her saying in how, she just said the response, like in the tone of her voice. This is important, right? And I could sense that from you, I don't know, intuition, I guess. How do we go ahead and navigate that though? Like, how do we, what happens when someone from the community says, well, how come we're not learning about Nathan Hale as much as we're learning about Harriet Tubman? I don't know, just some thoughts. What do we think?
Based on this morning's presentation, I feel like there's a definite connection with the inquiry model somewhere in this conversation, where students are the ones driving not only what questions you look at, but then also what conclusions are drawn. It's not a predetermined, here's the conclusion, it's in your textbook and you read it and you memorize it. It creates the space for there to be different perspectives even within the classroom. Not everyone has to agree on one fact and then memorize it and spit it back.
I think that's an approach. Any other ideas?
I think it can also come back a little bit to kind of the degree to which there's a planned balance, right? So if, for example, to go back to your example, like Harriet Tubman is specified and Nathan Hale is not specified in a curriculum document somewhere, then it gets a lot, I think, more reasonable and easier to have that conversation. You can kind of talk about the scope, right? Like, they don't learn as much about Nathan Hale, but they do learn about like all these other important like figures in history, not all of whom are Black, not all of whom are white. But if you can't point to that, then it's harder, I think, to have that conversation. You can only kind of point to that if you've kind of thought and mapped that out and can speak to like the overall balance, I think.
That's an interesting point. Thank you for that. And I'm sorry, Leszek, what do you teach?
I'm the supervisor of secondary humanities in Bristol. So
that's right.
So part of what we're thinking about in our curriculum and in social studies and in ELAs is how to kind of plan and structure that balance. So not just necessarily within one grade, but maybe across grades, right? It's the bigger that pool is and the more I think we have that thought through, the easier it is to point to and explain the rationale for why not Nathan Hale and why Harriet Tubman, but why these other people do that. Those aren't the only two people in history they learn about, right? So you can point to a balanced and broad representation, then I think that makes that easier.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? You're making me think about, okay, yeah, we're teaching, let's just use Nathan Hale because that's something I came up with, right? Connecticut hero. You almost had to think about, okay, yeah, we're teaching about Nathan Hale, but why Nathan Hale, right? So like, what is it? Was it sacrifice? Was it patriotism? Was it a commitment to community, liberty, justice, right? I mean, couldn't we use those themes to also teach other folks as well, right? Yeah, Nathan Hale is great, depending on what historian you talk to, right? What are the things that made this person great or make this story so compelling that we could then translate into other stories that maybe are right next to Nathan Hale, right? Nobody says Nathan Hale's got to go away, You know, I mean, maybe we, we stand them up, we look at them, evaluate. I just think that it lends itself to this higher level thinking that instead of just saying we're going to learn the name and the date and the action, well, why? And then how can I maybe be like that person or not? Lisa, I think you just, I thought you had your mic open. Sorry, Lisa.
I did, because I'm thinking, to me, Nathan Hale would be not the first question, but one of the responses, as would the other people. And they might know the answer. If you started doing this inquiry in 8th grade, you're going to have students say, hey, that sounds like a Nathan Hale would be the answer to that question, because I know about him, but they wouldn't know about other people. So fitting what we already know the students know because of past curricula, then those answers are going to fit in somewhere. And that information would then have to be connected to new information. Or what about this country? Let's figure this out. Or so.
Very good. Very good. Okay, we're going to tune back into Jason now, or I'm going to attempt to anyway. Let me pull him up. And this time we're going to be looking at what ways and with what resources can we get this right. So we started kind of on the big end of the spectrum. What does it look like in your experience? How can we navigate the scrutiny? Sure, that's kind of like the theoretical thing. Now let's get down to it, right? I'm a classroom teacher. Let's get down to what can we do actually in our classroom to make this happen. So let me just go ahead and hit play on this, and then I'm going to fast forward it by about 13 minutes. Boom, right there.
Strong point for Pacific.
No, right there.
And so this is also something that we can kind of identify too with Pacific Islander studies. What I see is, really potential, strong point for Pacific Islander studies is how closely, this is sort of mirrored, their experience in Connecticut is mirrored with Native Americans in the state. And indeed, many shared, a lived experience in the whaling industry in the 19th century and earlier. So there are these interesting connections between Pacific Islanders and Native Americans here in the state that I think addresses that kind of question of why include these folks. Well, they've been important to every major industry of the state, and they're here because the state chose particular forms of business, right, and ways of interacting in the world. And so, I think, that the addressing invisibility, reversing the model minority mindset, looking at outcomes-based sort of assessments, and, seeing outcomes for Asian Americans and others, and then also that this is really a way to place Connecticut in the context of the world. And so, what is it going to take to get this right? Well, I think one thing more broadly that I would love to see out of this work is an attention to the interconnectedness of communities, the interconnectedness of struggles, and ultimately that what can happen through that is this sort of shared understanding or shared desire for sustainable futures, which everyone can see themselves in. And so I think, that's not, I wouldn't say that's solely just for Asian American studies, Pacific Islander studies, but maybe something that can, as a larger kind of goal that crosses, all of these fields that we're considering. And for Asian American and Pacific Islander studies, though, I would say that, one of the things that would need to be done is to address, ethnic diversity, really being able to attend to, there are so many different faces of Asian America, and that, that can lead to, maybe making difficult choices of whether or not Chinese Americans stand in for all Asian Americans, but that will create, inaccuracies and a really challenging discourse. So the way that we present the question of coverage, I think, is important because what I hope will come out of this is an awareness of that ethnic diversity, and through that, being able to connect to all these different ways of being Asian American, and all of the different experiences that have shaped Pacific Islanders, right? So, say, Hawaii can't stand in for Samoa and Guam. They have their own experiences that are very distinct and major parts of U.S. history. So, that I would say, ethnic diversity within these umbrellas is really, is really significant. And also, I think one thing that we don't often do well in talking about ethnic diversity, or at least, understanding these larger categories in popular Asian American studies and popular Pacific Islander studies, is the relationship of war, imperialism, and colonization. These are the major driving forces which shape the US connection to Asia and the Pacific Islands, as well as the major driving forces which create the push and pull tensions, generate migration to the United States, right? So we think about very clearly like the Vietnam War and the presence of Southeast Asians in the United States, in Connecticut, is very much a part of a larger history of US imperialism in Asia, and an ongoing war that was shaped by the notion of the disposability of Southeast Asians. More bombs were dropped in Vietnam and Southeast Asia than all of World War II. And so, these were notions of warfare that were informed by racism, right? So, so these are the kinds of things that I think, while, there could be a challenge in thinking about what's age-appropriate conversations which would reveal or be able to explore, interrogate war, imperialism, and colonization. They're already being exposed to many of these things today, and understand them as a part of their own lived experience. So I think in some ways, the invisibility and the erasure of Asian Americans has been a way of not talking about war, imperialism, and colonization. So these are, really important pieces to include. And also, what does it take to get it right? Relationships and not silos, right? That we want to try to think of these kinds, the ways that these different communities interact beyond their ethnic, their co-ethnic peers. And then how do we look at the elementary area? Again, I think it's really, this is a foundational place where we can learn the maybe learning targets that are about recognizing and identifying ethnic diversity in Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, maybe through individuals, through cultures, through struggles, and their Connecticut community formations. Also, I think in the elementary area, it's really important that this kind of connects to a longer tradition of Asian American and Pacific Islander activism that's based in the arts, right? So poetry and painting and, the visual arts, the performing arts, music, these are all really important pieces to Asian American voices and Pacific Islander voices that I think really connects to the kind of, play-based learning that happens in elementary, and, much of the other forms of curriculum, not just strictly, say, social studies, but perhaps broader into music and to other parts of the school day. And, I think an important, piece to Pacific Islander studies is to recognize that there are Pacific Islander worldviews that are really compelling and fascinating about our interconnectedness, the full, not thinking of oceans as being empty, but being, really filled with life and culture and connection, and that there's, that these are really critical, cultural zones that are under threat because of climate change. So these are, maybe some pieces that can really serve to focus, some of the work in the elementary. In terms of advice, I would say, think about relationships, and not just, maybe, between Asian Americans and white folks, but Asian Americans and other people of color, right? Or Pacific Islanders and other people of color, right? Or Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans. One of the big pieces to the field of Asian American studies right now is recognizing the role that Asian Americans play in advancing the colonization of Pacific Islanders, right? So these fields aren't defined by a kind of, white other binary, but really trying to understand, the structural diversity of the structural complexity of racism, and that it involves many different positions. So that's a piece of advice, to maybe think through those lines, and that and to try to create connections and relationships, and also that I and my team at UConn and more broadly within the community are so excited for you to do this work. Please reach out to us. I can't stress that enough. I am so excited for this work that and will help as much as possible with your questions, coming up with helping you identify resources, and those things. This is really important work that's leading the country, and I'm committed to helping you all make the best effort possible on this. So thank you very much, and really looking forward to the work together. Thanks.
Okay. So again, I'm gonna bring back the question that we had, which was, oh, what happened to my stuff? Here we go. Which was, how can we get this right? In what ways and with what resources can we get it right? Things acting funky. Hold on a second. What do we think here?
One of the things I jotted down was just relationships, because it's an ongoing process. And so I think that that's the big piece. And it made me think about what Brian said in the beginning, about we always get started, but how do we make this continuous and everywhere? And so it's about the relationships at that administrative level, then going into your classrooms and throughout. And I just think that it's not only in your social studies class, right? He made a great point. Arts, music, all of those components are so important. And I think as educators, sometimes we want to jump in and get it right from the beginning, but this takes work and evolves over time, and we have to give ourselves the space and flexibility and grace to do that.
See a lot of people nodding their head yes with the relationships piece. Anybody else want to either speak to the relationships piece or another way that we can get this right?
Tony and everybody, I don't know if it's just me. Well, I know it's not just me, but I always had a hard time relating to things that happened so many years ago when they talked about like Nathan Hale and things like that. So I was jotting down some things also, and I was thinking of current events, and I just quickly looked at the headlines of my New York Times and said, oh my gosh, look at how many different cultures are represented in this just short synopsis of what's happening in the world and how we can relate for kids now, what's happening now, and then why did that occur? What's the background on that information? And I feel like there would be such a better connection for students if it was happening in their world now, and then going back to saying, why did it happen? That's just me.
I think that's,
and I'm not a social studies teacher by any means in 8th grade or anything. So it's just a comment.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Lisa. What's your role in education?
I'm a 1st grade teacher, but I was an international baccalaureate curriculum developer. So I'm very into the inquiry-based learning. And I was spoiled because my classroom of 20 might have had 7 different nationalities or 20, at different points. So I was very, very lucky to learn from all these families. And I like to say I bring that with me wherever I go. So I'm also a dyslexia therapist person. So I taught middle school for a while. So, but that's my gig.
That sounds great. It's
fun.
When I was first coming up, my principal, and I know not all principals are like this, but my principal always said, always, relationships first before anything. Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. That she would say that weekly, I would say. Every time we got together, sometimes it would be in the email, like constantly. So I was like drilled into my head about relationships. Clearly, it's the foundation of all learning. What about some other ways? So we're hearing about connecting to current events, building classroom community, getting to know each other. Is there any other way that we think we could get this right? Oh, I also heard someone say, give grace. Go ahead, Lauren.
I was going to say, I liked his point about choosing who you cover and addressing coverage for cultures. So thinking about who are the faces that we're using to represent these cultures, and why are we using these faces? And then asking, do these people best represent the culture that we're trying to study?
Thank you for that. Sometimes I think there's a little bit of inner work that goes along with this as well. I mean, what's wrong with just recognizing when something makes you feel uncomfortable and thinking about that? Oh, like, I feel uncomfortable teaching this topic. Okay. That's okay, right? It's okay to feel uncomfortable, but then you gotta look at it like, oh, why do I feel uncomfortable? And that's the hard part. That's the layers.